Great. Thank you for accepting our invitation for registering and being part of this very exciting assessment that we are going to roll out. It's been something that we've been working on with Genome for a few months, and then through our collaboration, it will be quite an exciting and insightful assessment that will be rolled out by Akshat and Stefan. We are inviting all of you on this platform who joined with us today is to do exactly what's on the screen, is to collaborate towards accelerating the Sri Lankan startup ecosystem. It's a collaborative journey. So to set the stage for Startup Genome, who will be presenting the assessment to us, our journey is mapped in this particular way. So our country's journey took place back in about 2010 when we were outsourcing destination. ICTA was privileged to get involved with AT Kearney. That's back in 2012 when Sri Lanka was ranked number 21. And with engaging with AT Kearney and then exploring the areas of where we need to improve in the GSLI, Global Services Location Index, we moved from 21 to rank 11. And next, in our next wave of growth during product engineering, we engaged with Gartner. We were placed in the top offshoring locations list. And finally, it's called the Offshoring Location Index, we were within the top 6. We were within the top 6 in Asia Pacific as offshoring destinations. In the same time, we also engaged with Startup Genome. This history goes back to 2016. The first Disrupt Asia, the founder of Startup Genome was here. Startup Genome was also a startup at that time when we started our relationship. And from that time onwards, we've been featured on the Global Startup Ecosystem Report in 2017 and in 2020. Genome also conducted a survey understanding the effects of COVID, which was very helpful to us, which we had about more than 100 participants providing info. And next was this deep dive assessment that we are going to unravel in front of you. So Startup Genome is a global organization, advisory firm, which have advised over 100 governments and policymakers and innovation players of the innovation ecosystem. If you look at this map, it's very evident, and you see the Information Communication Technology Agency as the member for Sri Lanka right down. So it's my privilege to unravel this assessment, which has been neatly constructed with the participation of 111 startup ecosystem founders. It's called the Founder Survey, and many more startup ecosystem enablers. This research has been conducted and then been analyzed by Startup Genome themselves. It's my privilege to introduce Stefan and Akshat, who were the authors of this report. If I give just a small brief of Stefan. Stefan headed the international consulting practice at the UK ecosystem agency called Connectedness, which I think we all know, and was also the managing director of Digital Switzerland in Zurich. So he is not a newcomer on understanding ecosystems and consulting governments and industry. He also happens to be an executive director for early at Arthur Andersen and also Ernst & Young. His colleague Akshat was previously engaged in Gartner, the consulting agency that we were also engaged with earlier, even before that at KPMG, and now works in ecosystem assessments, insight generation, and strategy recommendations for Startup Genome clients. He has been one of our main counterparts in doing the assessment last year. And right now, he's working on strategy and road mapping for the ecosystem in Sweden, United States, and Philippines. So they come with a plethora of experience and the knowledge that they have. I trust that after the presentation is done, you would use the maximum time that we have to drill down to ask questions, because these two gentlemen comes with a whole heap of experience in consulting other governments and ecosystems and supporting them to build. So without further ado, I'll stop my screen sharing and then hand it over to Stefan.
So Chandra, thank you ever so much, and I feel humbled, privileged to be part of this webinar, and I'm speaking, I think, for Akshat as well. Great pleasure to be with you. We will do our utmost to deliver value to you, to be open to discussion, and we're really looking forward to this session here as the beginning of a journey where we can build up a dialogue and share our experiences, our knowledge. That's all what Startup Genome is about. We are a global knowledge network, and we want to foster the exchange of ecosystem knowledge, helping each other, like startup founders should be helping each other. We try our very best to make sure ecosystems try to learn from each other, discuss policy, share good ideas, good concepts, and the not so good ones, and really improve by iterating and learning from their peers. We would love to take you through quite a collection of PowerPoint slides right now. Please bear with us. It's going to be a little bit of a slideshow for a moment to explain what we have seen, our perspective, and it's an objective perspective. It is a data-based perspective on the Sri Lankan ecosystem. Where are you today? Where do we see opportunities? Where do we see factor gaps, which are not a bad thing. They're absolutely normal in an ecosystem, but ones that we would recommend prioritizing, addressing jointly, working towards fixing them in order to further accelerate what already is an impressive journey. That's what we want to do. Then we want to open it up to really a vibrant discussion. Throw your questions, concepts, criticism at us. We love to have this exchange. In the end, this is a conversation ecosystem to ecosystem, founders to founders. That's what we intend. If you bear with me for a moment, I would love to take you through jointly with Akshat, who has actually done the vast amount of the work that we are going to present right now. So the Sri Lankan startup ecosystem is the objective. It is an assessment. We wanted to understand first, where are you? And then see what's working very well, what are opportunities still untapped, where are success factor gaps that we need to address. And these are buzzwords, but we'll explain what we mean as we go through the presentation. So first of all, a little bit of an overview, methodology, executive summary, and then we go into the detail.
Is when we look at ecosystems, and we work with more than 100 around the world right now, is we try to classify them into different phases, and you can take 10 phases, 4 phases, it doesn't matter. But what we are trying to do is to say a startup ecosystem behaves like an ecosystem in the real world, in biology. It develops, it grows, it matures over time, and as it grows and as it matures, and that's the important point, the strategies to help the issues fundamentally change. And what we have found in the last 10 years, there are 4 phases where you can put basically every ecosystem in the world into. One is called activation, the second globalization, the third attraction, the fourth integration. Let me start with integration. That would be Silicon Valley in New York and London as an example. Very different characteristics, very different policies that need to be applied, as opposed to activation, globalization, or attraction. The important point is, as you are in a certain life cycle phase, a number of strategies apply. These are the right things, the right policies to do. And when I say right, it's not my personal belief or Akshat's belief, it's what data have told us, and 10 years of analysis have told us. As you move from one phase to the next, for argument's sake, from activation to globalization, these strategies fundamentally change. So every few years, you really need to sit down, look at where are you, understand your status quo, and readdress what you are doing in order to further develop the ecosystem. What doesn't work is to sit down and say, okay, the next 10 years, I'm going to deploy a policy and it's going to be the right thing. There are, apologies, every 3 to 4 years, there's a certain step that needs making. So let's start with status quo first. Where are we in Sri Lanka? Unsurprisingly, we classify Sri Lanka as an activation stage ecosystem, a young ecosystem that's developing fast, but is still in the global context relatively small. And a number of strategies apply here. And as you move up further, and hopefully in the next few years entering into globalization phase, then we should sit down again and kind of review what is the right approach. For now, we are looking at activation phase. In order to put that a little bit into context, and something we strongly believe at in Startup Genome, is peer comparison, learning from peers. As an entrepreneur, you try to learn from others who are developing business models. So do we when it comes to ecosystem development. You can see Sri Lanka here in the middle, classified as 1, that's phase 1 or activation. Left and right to you are other activation ecosystems that we use for peer comparison. When we look at data, we look at those because they are meaningful to Sri Lanka and compare against Manila, New Zealand, and Estonia to have a European example. And further out on this slide, you see further developed ecosystems such as Kuala Lumpur, KL, which is in the globalization phase, or Bangalore, that's even higher. On the right-hand side, Singapore. Just for argument's sake, I got a peer comparison, but I'm also looking at a few data points with ecosystems that are much further ahead, possibly 5, 6, 7 years ahead, just to show the differences in data and perspective. But the really important ones are your peers.
Ideas that does not have any.
Okay. In summary, what you are seeing here, color-coded, is our success factor model. To very briefly explain it, on the bottom of it, you see something on the left-hand side, you can see the wording local system. This is your ecosystem locally, the factors you can influence locally. You're not dependent on anybody else in the world. Talent, funding, founders, the organizations, the incubators, accelerators, and so forth, and your community. That's what we call local connectedness. That's the quality of your community. Things you can influence, you yourselves as ecosystem leaders and participants. All of them result into something that we call startup output. These success factors work well, startup output will grow. You will create more startups. The second level is what we call the global system. That's where you are connecting to the rest of the startup world. In terms of knowledge, in terms of market opportunity, in terms of selling to other markets and developing a startup, scaling a startups to other markets. So that's something where you're dependent on the connections outside of Sri Lanka, outside of your own local ecosystem. We will take both perspectives. The color coding already takes it away a little bit, what we can see. And let's start with the very positives. So something like local connectedness, you got a functioning, a good community amongst your founders. And we'll go into the detail with what we mean with that and why it is so important and how we can quantify it. You are developing quite a number of startups. So startup output, again, a foundation of community, is working in Sri Lanka. Success factor gaps, certainly there are in funding and talent and founders. And don't be afraid, it looks a little bit red in our color coding here, but it's completely normal. This is not typical for Sri Lanka only. This is typical for most activation ecosystems. They simply have success factor gaps when it comes to startup and talent experience. They have funding gaps. They have some gaps in the knowledge that young founders really bring into the ecosystem. It's absolutely typical for this phase, and that's something important to point out. And obviously, young ecosystems are less connected to the world. We'll see the detail in a few moments. That's why we come to the conclusion based on data that global connectedness, the way you interact with the rest of the world, still can be improved. But that's a quick fire summary. Let's get into the detail and see what we really mean. Before we do so, allow us to thank all those who have supported our work. We've done more than 100 founder surveys and lots of qualitative discussions one-on-one with accelerators, incubators, government agencies under the leadership of ICTA, startup founders themselves, not only by means of electronic survey, but by means of real life discussion with investors, the same, and with university represented here. So a big thank you to all those who have contributed. Without their participation, we would not be able to do an assessment. And be assured, in every peer comparison, when we use peer data, it's built on the same mechanism, the same methodology, so it's really comparable. Yeah, let's jump right in what we have seen. I mentioned ecosystem life cycle model, activation phase, so a young ecosystem with growth. And I mentioned that every phase has the right a certain number of strategies. For an activation ecosystem, we got three priorities that everybody needs to be looking at. I'll explain the detail. Grow the number of startups first. Success is in ecosystem design, ecosystem development, a question of numbers. So growing the number of startups is our first priority. Second, increase startup quality. What we mean here is the survival rate of startups, getting to revenue, getting onward investment, finding clients that help them develop more constant revenue streams and to grow. And thirdly, and again, every activation ecosystem I know in the world has funding gaps, increase early stage funding gaps, not late stage, not series B+, but early stage from pre-seed to grant finance to angel to Series A. That's really what we need to be looking at this certain phase. In a few years and entering globalization phase, which we totally would expect, these strategies will change and we would be presenting a very different slide. Why is this so relevant? Let's have a look here. Regional and enabling factors, your talent, your funding supply locally, your institutions at universities, incubators, accelerators, mentors. These are regional enabling factors, the things you can work with as a community and influence, and they can help you create more and more startups. So what we would be hoping for on average is about 1,000 startups per million people. That would be really a really good number. Make the funnel as big as possible, because we all know 90% of all startups that get founded will die. The founders and team members will get, forgive me the wording, recycled into the ecosystem and do something else that's more successful. That is a very healthy process. So in a sense, the wider our funnel, the more success we will see throughout the ecosystem. That's an undeniable fact. So that's number one. In the middle, that's what we mean with startup quality. Can we change the design of this funnel so that less startups die? More startup quality means more startups get to revenue, they get invested, they get follow-on investment. And the funnel as such broadens and you get a better scale-up rate. And in the end, scale-ups are the ones that are creating economic effect, ecosystem value in terms of valuations, but also job creation. So they are the ones that are really driving the more economic, societal, positive impacts of a startup ecosystem. It is not necessarily the very, very young startups. That's what we are trying to explain here. So big funnel and then try to open it up as good as possible. That's what we are aiming for. Growing the number of startups. Where are we at the moment? We believe with our assessment, our data science, that we got about 450 startups in Sri Lanka. The number, you may debate it. It is based on an algorithm. It may be 500, it may be a few less than 450, but roughly that's the kind of size that we are looking at. And you're perfectly in line with other activation phase ecosystems. That's what we would expect. Here's on the screen, if you see my cursor. That's where we are, that's where Sri Lanka sits. Let's put that though into perspective to population. I was arguing about 1,000 startups per million population would be a really good number, a really good density. Where are we here? And we see we would have expected more, and that's maybe worth interpreting. So looking at the entire population of Sri Lanka, we would have expected, based on simple data, we would have expected more startups. There is room to grow. We shouldn't overestimate these numbers here. We shouldn't be too theoretical. I understand perfectly well that there's a difference between somebody living in a capital city or in a larger city and somebody being in a rural area, not part of the community. So we need to qualify that a little bit. But from our perspective, there's room to grow. So growing the number of startups, there's quite some way to go, even to reach the phase average for activation ecosystems, as your peers are succeeding in doing. Why is this so incredibly important? When we look at size, we plot size against ecosystem value, we find that growing in size is not a linear process, it's an exponential process. You are here at the moment, 450. If you grow up to a 700, 600, 700, 800 startups, you will see exponential effects, cluster effects. Because you got more startups, you got more support organizations, more investors will get interested, and the curve will start to exponentially grow. The number of startups, the investments, the ecosystem value will start to exponentially grow. That has happened in every ecosystem we know. As they grow, the effects are amplified. So doubling is not doubling the number of startups does much more than just double the number of ecosystem value and job creation and so forth. So it's really important to get here. And that's why we are so keen on growing the number of startups and creating these cluster effects. How can we get there? Many ecosystems have asked us, can we get to more startups? Can we grow startup output by means of importing tech talent, attracting entrepreneurs and their teams to come to our place and develop their startups here? And what we say is actually, we've never seen that to work. There's not a single strategy in the world where importing and attracting startups and founders is really working in a young ecosystem. That works for a very mature ecosystem like London, where I'm sitting, but it doesn't work for activation ecosystems. You can see the data here. Even Silicon Valley, the red one, the red part is the attraction from the world. Even Silicon Valley is not built on attracting startups from everywhere. It is growing organically very, very strongly. And the same applies more for our peers. Here's KL as an example. There's a very, very small number of foreign attractions. So you need to grow organically. You need to use your own success factors, your own ecosystem in order to grow the community. And the ecosystem attraction from abroad is not the right strategy at this point. And this might change. Where could we get to if we really work together as good as we can? As a peer comparison, we often use the example of the University of Waterloo. That's a region, an industrial region in the north, in Canada, which years ago has proven or has shown a best practice attempt in order to connect university activity, to inspire a culture of entrepreneurship, and to build and to spin off as many companies as possible. It's really a best practice for instilling the culture of entrepreneurship with their students and really creating lots of startups. And if we take them as a benchmark, and they are a really good one, you theoretically could improve the number of startups that get created in Sri Lanka based on your university, the numbers of universities and students, by a factor of 5. Again, this might be a little bit theoretical. That applies across all Sri Lanka population. So realistically, we would say 3 to 5. 3x would be a good number where you could get to realistically. If the right measures are applied and we succeed in getting more students motivated to explore entrepreneurship and to try at least to become an entrepreneur and set up a startup. So just to keep in mind, 450 now times 3, we would be at 1,350 startups. We would be well into the exponential effects that I was talking about so much because they are so important. Yeah, that's where we want to get to. Secondly, and one of the most important factors that help founders succeed and create a successful local ecosystem, startup ecosystem, is community. And we are probably one of the only organizations in the world that tries to measure what admittedly sounds like a fluffy concept. What is community? How can you measure the quality of a community? We can with the survey instruments we use. And we get a feeling for how well does a community work? Are founders helping each other? If so, that's great. And we will show the effects. Can they approach an investor without any commercial interest and just ask for help, for advice? Yes, great, you get a community. Can they go to an existing organization or a company like Ernst & Young, KPMG, Kinsey, whatever, ask for a piece of regulatory advice for 10 minutes or half an hour and get that? If yes, that's great because you got a functioning community. Where are we here with Sri Lanka? We are below the average for local connectedness across all ecosystems in the activation phase. So we would have hoped for a little more. There is community, it is working, but it is not yet perfect. So from our perspective, working more on making these connections amongst founders and other parts of the community is important. And you can see the differences here. Manila is certainly ahead in that perspective, yeah, if you want to have a local peer. Why is it so relevant? Community, helping each other, having these community connections. All other factors equal, same talent, same funding, same policies, same environment. If you got a great community quality, your startup founders and their revenues will grow twice as fast, 2.1x. This is not a theoretical chart here. This is data from all around the world that we've gathered. 2.1x is the factor you can grow just by improving the quality of community. There we are. Let's unravel that not theoretical, but this statistical concept a little bit. We divide local connectedness or quality of community into 2 key measures. One is called sense of community. The second one, right-hand side of this graph, is the relationship index. Let's start with the first one, left-hand side. Community. Community means, can I as a founder ask somebody else for help for an hour? Do I get it for free? Without commercial interest. Can I do that? Do I get the right answer? Do I get help? Yes or no? Am I willing to give the same service, the same help to somebody else without commercial interest? The pay it forward culture that's so prominent in the Valley and other places. Where are we? We got reasonably good results, but again, we are way below average. So working on this culture of helping each other out and really collaborating is a driver, and that needs strengthening. And there's some measures that can help develop that particular factor. So here we are not as good as we should be and as we could be. Relationship index is the second part of this concept, and it tells me basically how many relationships do I as a founder have, how many other founders do I know, how many investors do I know, how many technical experts or mentors do I know, and can pick up the phone. And again, we are significantly below global average. We would have been hoping for slightly more. These are things, it's not a negative to show these gaps. It is an opportunity to very quickly improve the quality of your community and local connectedness. Yeah, these are things we would recommend working on because the effects are so dramatic, and the measures that drive these concepts and the improvements are not very expensive. They are more entrepreneurial-minded activities as opposed to large-scale budget investments. So incredibly effective. Here again, if we unravel this concept a little bit more, this gives you a feeling for how strong are founders collaborating amongst each other. And again, it's not the greatest of results. There is a lot of leeway. There's a lot of way to go. And how good are they connected to local investors, be them angels or VCs, or technical experts in corporations or in professional services firms, law firms, whatever. This is slightly better. So this part, there's more connectivity and there's a little bit more helping each other already happening. But again, there's a gap remaining. So we need to work on both aspects. And here we see it again for the relationship index, founder to founder, founder to investor, gaps. There is opportunity just to make them meet more and talk more and exchange more, and we will get better results. The expert part is relatively well developed, so that's maybe less of a worry. But founder to founder, founder to investor, that's maybe where our focus really should lie. That's for startup quantity. How do we drive? How do we get more companies founded? This concept of community, local connectedness is one of the most important ones. And I really, Akshat and I really would recommend looking into that in detail because it's under your control. It doesn't require enormous investment. It is more a mindset and activity of an ecosystem. Secondly, how do we improve startup quality? So the survival rate of startups, which is all about getting contracts, getting funding, building quality products that actually are sellable, successful in a market. That's what we want to look at right now. What are the major components of startup quality? It's the founders' know-how. Do they know how to start and run a business and scale a business technically, but also from a managerial perspective? Customer access, is the market large enough? Do they really connect, particularly if they're B2B with corporations, public sector agencies, and sell? Do they have the right growth skills, marketing and growth skills to sell their products and scale this process? And last but not least, are they able to reach global customers or customers outside of the domestic market? Because in the end, we are looking at startups. We want hypergrowth. We don't want to serve only a community of 10 million or 20 million. I'm sitting in a country with 60 million people. We are way too small to build a global category leader. Our startups need to think about global markets almost from day one if they want to succeed. And last but not least, talent access. So do I really have the talent available in my community? Technical, engineering, but also managerial, in order to sustain a growing ecosystem. We want to produce many more startups, 3x, and startups that start to scale and suck up top talent and have the need for top talent. So how do we look in Sri Lanka at the moment? Because these are the decisive factors for scaling for startup quality. Let's start with global connectedness, our concept where we measure the links between your community and the global community of ecosystem founders and startup ecosystems. This is about knowledge. I tap into knowledge in another place. I see a business model that I'm trying to dream up, and I see that somebody in New York or Singapore is already working on it. Then I need to pivot. I need to think about that. Having this information is important, number one. Secondly, do I have the relationships to start a sales conversation? Can I start building an opportunity to sell abroad? That's all behind global connectedness. Again, looking at the results from our survey, Sri Lanka is more focused on its domestic ecosystem at the moment. It is not as connected as a Manila, which you see on the left-hand side, to the global fabric of ecosystems, or New Zealand. Well, New Zealanders are traveling all the time, so that's pretty much to be expected. But have a look, small place in Europe, Estonia, totally outward focused. It is small, but it's totally outward focused and extremely successful in creating scale-up companies. Whereas a KL, here on the left-hand side, somewhat comparable to Sri Lanka, a little bit ahead, again, in need of expanding these relationships outside of the domestic market. Yeah. The only two examples, or one example in the world, we don't need global connectedness to sell abroad, and that's China. And it's very obvious why. With 1 billion people, it's quite easy to have a large domestic market. It can grow a lot before you come to the end of your home market. But for Sri Lanka, this doesn't apply. So driving global connections is important. We also look at founders' ambition, founders' ability to produce a service, a product, a concept that would be competitive globally. And we ask them if they got a global strategy in place when they start and when they build a startup. Are they outward focused? Are they trying to build a category leader going forward? When we ask them, do you believe you have a globally leading product or you're working on one? The results are very modest. So many founders admit that they are doing something that might be successful locally in Sri Lanka, but they don't believe that it will be hugely competitive internationally. This is going to limit global connectedness and global market reach, the ability to export. Startup quality. So what can we do as an ecosystem to help our founders to improve their competitiveness, develop the product a little better so they are more competitive, they are more sellable abroad. Important. And do they have global strategies? Do they think about their products in B2C, particularly in B2B? Do they think about reaching out to a market outside of Sri Lanka right from day one, not as an afterthought, not 5 years after building the product and then seeing that it somehow could fit the American market, but it doesn't really because we missed something obvious that would have been obvious. So from day one, are we employing these global strategies, yes or no? Again, we have a huge factor gap here. And this is something really to work on, to say from day one, you need to think about a market that's broader than what you can see around your office. Really important. I'm German by passport. When I talk to we get a very conservative culture. Everybody here is trying to build a great engineered product. And they try to get to local revenue very quickly. Nobody is thinking about a global strategy. And the number of scale-ups we are creating in Germany is fairly limited for the size of its economy. Yeah, it's underplaying its potential, and the same might be happening here. If you drill even further and ask founders, why is this so? Why are you not thinking about building a more globally competitive product? Motivation, heart at the right place, absolutely. Look at motivation here. They're highly motivated, way above average. It's fine. They want to change the world in a sense with their startup. But if you ask them, do you have a differentiated product? Are you working towards a global market, 30 billion plus, whatever it is, a global market? The answer is really no. It's way beyond below activation average. Speculating on reasons can be talent, a lack of knowledge. You're not as connected to the global world as others are. That limits the ability to build a really competitive product. It might be early stage funding gaps. If I don't have enough financial runway, I'm trying to build something and create revenue very quickly. I cannot invest another 3-4 months to make my product really fit for an international market. So a funding gap might well be a reason for these results. It is not cultural. Everybody is ambitious in the Sri Lankan ecosystem. Something else is going on that's limiting us. Global connectedness, if we get this right, what's the effect? Very comparable to the local community measure. If we can improve here and change the way startup entrepreneurs approach the global market opportunity, go global from day one in a sense, they would be growing based on what we see in other ecosystems, 2x faster, all other factors equal. It's the same concept, but this time it's global connectedness. So again, here's a factor to very, very quickly accelerate the revenue of startup founders and overall the valuation of the ecosystem, 2x. I think this just reinforces it a little bit. What we are showing here is why is it important for a Sri Lankan entrepreneur early on to reach out? Because GDP obviously for Sri Lanka is fairly small compared to other markets. So if I'm in a smaller market, it could be in Estonia, it could be in Switzerland, a smaller market, I need to reach out very, very early on. Am I in China or the US market? The situation is different. I can work for a much longer time in my local market, in the Indian market, obviously as well. Yeah, so global strategies, global connectedness, something that we need to dial up very early on in Sri Lanka. Second, startup quality. What else is influencer? Is an influencer talent access? Do we have the right engineering talent? Do we have the right managerial talent to build a business? And what we see here is a bit of a mixed picture, ambivalent picture. From an engineering perspective, we are well below average. And it's a conundrum. Yeah? Sri Lanka is churning out so many highly qualified students. It's not a question of talent supply from universities per se, but something else must be going on. What's going on most likely is that outsourcing companies, other employers, more traditional employers, are sucking up the talent, and it's not finding its way to the same degree into the startup ecosystem. We really got a gap here in the engineering part, and we need to work on it. Otherwise, we will be starving our startups of the engineering quality and quantity they deserve and need. Bit better, the situation when it comes to managerial talent, managing companies. I think that's where we are looking at a better supply and a more sustained supply. Having said that, we were arguing in the beginning of this presentation that you really should increase the ecosystem by a factor of 3x minimum. If that happens, all these talent gaps will just be amplified if you don't take action now. If you want to be in 3x in 5 years' time, we need to work on talent, particularly engineering talent, but also managerial talent right now. Otherwise, this is not going to happen properly. One concept we wanted to test for, and important here is the right-hand side of this graph. Why do we seemingly not compete with more traditional organizations when it comes to attracting talent? We see a very limited use of equity stock options. And I mean, as a startup, and given the funding situation, which we will talk about, we probably can't compete with a government organization or with a traditional corporate in providing salaries, income packages. So what's the option here? If I want to attract a student to join my company, it needs to be stock options and having been part of the journey and the upside. That is not happening very much. It's a huge gap. So ESOs and employee equity stock options for employees, certainly a concept that we need to dial up in order to attract many more to join the startup ecosystems. It's a very surprising gap. The size of this gap is surprising to us, and we should discuss why that is the case. Focusing on the right areas, founder know-how. So how do we drive the know-how of founders? What are potential areas of solution? Customer access. How do I get to local customers? This drives startup output. How do I get to international customers? How do I build the growth skills and the respective access to channels? And last but not least, access to talent. These are the things we should be working on in order to drive startup quality further up. We will discuss a little bit details later on. We wanted to show you an example where an ecosystem leadership team really has made a difference. This is Frankfurt. In Frankfurt, historic Germany, Frankfurt historically has not been known as a startup ecosystem at all, by any means. But years ago, ecosystem founders and leaders decided to focus on a particular sector. Frankfurt is a traditional financial center. They thought there is an opportunity for fintech. And by building a very closely knitted system of startup founders, educational aspects, talent supply from universities, and engaging the traditional organizations, the banks, the insurance companies that already were present, they were able to dramatically increase the growth and the quality of their ecosystem. Frankfurt today is one of the most successful fintech ecosystems, extremely fast growing. Extremely successful. Not good for anything else, but in fintech, this really worked because they were able to connect startup founders with clients, potential clients, get them to revenue, get them to POC opportunities, and also serve young founders with real life, really valuable challenges, problems to solve. That happened here. It's one of the best practice examples we really can recommend when it comes to how do I bring in the corporate, everything that I've already got, the traditional corporations, the universities, and build such a cluster. Really good example, 5 years development time. Yeah, right here it is, very small ecosystem. People help each other more because they are connected in this fintech community. Success breeds success. So if people start talking about it, they attracted more funding. And today, the word is spread around the world. Founders are actually visiting Frankfurt and they're considering it for fintech for their company. So it's really, you can see how this has built up very, very quickly. A second consideration we wanted to bring to you is to say, using strategies, using government budgets, initiatives, the sweat and support from all of us, from all of you in the ecosystem. Should we deploy this all across every subsector in the ecosystem in Sri Lanka, or should we try to find a number of niches of industry sectors or other opportunities where you feel you are strong and you easily could become much more competitive? At Genome, in our work, we are great friends of a subsector strategy, of a cluster strategy. We are always saying we're taking a very simplistic example. If you got 2 guys who can work with wood, you got 2 guys who can work with wood. If you got 20 of them, you got a furniture industry. It's the old concept of industrial clusters, Michael Porter. And it really holds true in ecosystem development. So our question would be, are there a number of subsectors in Sri Lanka where you can have a certain focus in terms of funding, in terms of building an ecosystem, community, in terms of activating the corporations, enterprises, the traditional ones, and really knitting them together with the ecosystem, similar to what Frankfurt did, in order to accelerate the development of startups and startup quality, because then they're working towards meaningful challenges, they're working towards real revenue and contracts. What we can see here on this slide are global trends for subsectors, the very advanced ones, fast growth, really large exits, advanced manufacturing, robotics, AI, big data, etc. You can see them. Much more interesting on this slide from my perspective are the newcomers, the niches in the world. So these are subsectors where you don't see the large exits as yet, but you can see a hell of a lot of early stage funding going into these subsectors. Agricultural technology, agtech, and new food, huge in terms of growth rates. And I think it might be one of those where Sri Lanka, because traditionally has a strong agricultural industry and exports, really would benefit from looking at strengthening the tech ecosystem around agriculture, food supply chains, etc. It's just one example, and we don't understand Sri Lankan industry well enough, but as to really make the right recommendation. But we would recommend for you to have a discussion around, are there subsectors like agriculture, like tourism, where technology is not as ripe, not as developed. Silicon Valley has not covered all bases. There is a real market opportunity internationally, and it is something that's relevant to your own economy, to your own people. And you have these experiences in Sri Lanka, in your own community. Yeah. So these are examples maybe that are really interesting. Second lease of life, we can see for some gaming, education, tech, and life sciences. These were subsectors that almost had stalled in the development over the last 5 years, but got much impetus. Obviously, you know why. It's a result of the COVID pandemic, where education tech all of a sudden had a very different meaning to most of us around the world. Huge market opportunity, all of a sudden life sciences, telehealth. And the same also went for digital media and gaming, really amplified again. And we believe these trends are actually going to stay. So just as a consideration and for debate, that's something we would recommend. What we are showing here is the result of such a discussion, which we had with your colleagues in Seoul. So for Sri Lanka, we haven't had this discussion as yet, but in Seoul we went as far to say, what is the global potential, the y-axis here on this graph? What's the global potential where if I'm successful, I can start exporting. My startups can scale and grow. That's the one axis, data from Genome, and then the local ecosystem potential. Where am I strong? And for Seoul, the decision became quite obvious. They are already incredibly strong in gaming. That's great. They showed quite some potential in life sciences, and they were extremely strong in applied blockchain, including in supply chains. Huge global potential, strong locally. So that's something to definitely bet on. Yeah, examples. And then a few other examples where the ecosystem locally wasn't as strong, but it is a fast growth global trend. So something like AMR, advanced manufacturing, robotics also proved interesting to them. To have this debate, where should we be playing? Where should we be focusing our efforts and budgets in the end might be quite a meaningful discussion. We would encourage ICTA and obviously you all as a community to further go through these considerations. Last but not least, before we run out of time, we spoke about growing the number of startups, get to these 1,200, 1,300, improving the survival rate, a cluster strategy, engaging with traditional corporations and the public sector as clients, important, developing the right talent. The last one, and that's always the case in any activation ecosystem, phase ecosystem, is funding gaps, and increasing early stage funding is the name of the game. And we want to show you a little bit where we are. What we are looking at here is the seed round size in Sri Lanka for a startup. They are fairly small, even compared to your peers in Manila, in KL, etc. Surprise or remarkably small. And in the end, this means if I don't get the right funding, I'm running out of runway and I can't develop a competitive product. We already talked about that effect to a degree. So that's the first shot at the data. Let's qualify this a little bit more. Here we've put seed funding rounds in context to salaries, the salaries for your engineers. And positively, Sri Lanka is a place where engineering talent and startup talent is still affordable, very different to other places in the world where it comes at a huge premium. If you put both into context, smaller funding rounds, but also smaller salary requirements, actually funding runway doesn't look too bad. So your average founder has got a funding runway of about 18 months. That's a pretty good look at your peers. KL has less, New Zealand has less, Estonia has less, Singapore has less as a hugely developed ecosystem. That's a real positive. So if somebody gets a seed round, given the wage levels at the moment, funding should be allow for a reasonably good runway. So for those, and that's an important statement to make, for those that actually get seed finance. The other side of that equation, though, is how many are actually getting to a seed round. And you can see the dark green and bold line here on the chart. Sri Lanka, again, here, the dotted line, if you can see my cursor. That shows you what's the proportion of seed-funded startups, how many startups that get created actually get a seed round. That number is incredibly low. So we're looking at about 3% of the entire population that actually gets a seed round. If they get one, as I showed with the previous slide, they are good for 17, 18 months. It's fine. It's a good result, but it's way too few that actually have access to seed funding. That's probably one of the slides really to take home. This is a big thing we need to cover and address. Looking at Series A, pretty much the same picture. We are well below activation phase average. So Series A, huge funding gap in Series A. And this is going to limit scaling companies, and this is going to limit expansion abroad. And wage levels here are less relevant because if you want to scale, you need to hire a business development director in the States or in Singapore, elsewhere. They come at a cost. Yeah, so a real issue in Series A as well. And here again, we see the proportion of seed-funded startups that, of Series A funded startups, pretty similar to the seed funding gaps, about less than 1%, about 1% that we can see here that actually get Series A. So again, we get issues here in peer comparison. What to do? Important. We want to highlight that. Don't just go and ask the VCs and devise policy that helps VCs to deploy more Series A and onward. It needs the process, the funding, solving the funding gap. The process needs to start with pre-seed and seed. This needs fixing first, and we've talked about it. And then at a later point, maybe in 1 or 2 years' time or 3 years' time, we should be looking at improving Series A capability. Yeah, there are examples on the left-hand side. Hong Kong, that's the red line. They took a piece of policy. They were in a similar situation from a funding perspective as you are in the results. They said, okay, we deploy a lot of government money into the VC industry. Let's see what happens. And what happened was an incredible waste of taxpayers' money and investment because we never got a deal flow that actually was investable. VCs had more money to play with, but they didn't have targets, qualified startups to invest in because Hong Kong at this point missed to clean up and to deal with their pre-seed and seed gaps first, work with their angel groups, etc. They didn't. So not a recommendable policy. Really stick to this pre-seed, seed first, and then we can talk about Series A. This would be the most effective way to go forward. Similar example here for Melbourne, given the time, let's not go into other examples too much. Why is it important to look at funding solutions for pre-seed, seed? When we look at the data here, we asked founders where do they find funding and what's their financial background. A lot of them come from less rich backgrounds. This is not rich kids that are founding, or the kids of rich families that are founding startups. It's people who actually need to earn money for a living. If we don't solve this gap here, which we can see again, for pre-seed and seed, we deprive people who are not from a wealthy background of the opportunity to start a startup, for possibly the best and the most motivated people who do not have access, for very obvious reasons, to engage with the startup ecosystem. So that's something to take away. We need to find a fix here. That's likely a government strategy, we would see. So in that sense, let's address seed first. Median amounts are okay at the moment. And the runway is a good one for those that get a seed round in summary, but the percentage of startups that get founded actually get a seed round is way too small, and that contributes to a relatively high death rate. Yeah, that's something to address. Then we can talk later on Series A, as mentioned, where the median amounts at the moment also seem small, and that's directly affecting the ability for them to scale. So again, survival rate is not where it should be. For scaling companies, for Series A startups, the death rate is too high. It's something what we would like to address. It's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem. What comes first, lack of funding or the quality of deal flow? I think it's addressing both at the same time and keeping the development in sync. More startups, better equipped, attract more funding from private investors. But you need to kickstart it. Systems in the activation phase rely on a very good mix of government policy, of money being put into funding solutions in pre-seed and seed, but engaging the private sector and jointly developing deal flow. So as an idea, building up good angel groups and then propping them up with some government funding vehicles, instruments that allow business angels to write bigger checks and to write more checks. These are typically the examples that need looking at. Really keep this in sync. So we improve on funding, but we also improve on startup quality and the deal flow that's actually investable. That brings us basically to the summary of our recommendations here. You see the lenses again: startup output, startup quality, early stage funding. I believe you just want to drag out one or two or three of recommendations each to illustrate what we mean. And if you read these slides, that they become meaningful to you. We've also put onto a time scale starting today and then going towards 2025 as a vision, where these activities in the right sequencing should sit, because we shouldn't be doing everything at the same time. Don't look at Series A or Series B right now, it's too early. What should happen right now to drive startup output is talent development. What can we do in universities to motivate more students to actually consider entrepreneurship and be equipped to be successful? De-risk entrepreneurship. We see many comparable countries where many young founders, potential founders, would-be founders, get discouraged. They say, I want to become an entrepreneur, and their parents or their friends tell them, no, don't be crazy. Go to a government job, apply to a job in a traditional telecom. You'll be safe, you'll get a pension. You don't risk your life and your career by starting a startup. So they don't become their unfulfilled startup potential. We got a few good examples. Serbia, quite economically deprived state in Eastern Europe, has really stepped up and said, yeah, we recognize this problem. What can we do? We don't have too much money to deploy, but what we can do is we give preferential treatment to those who have started a company, founders, and they've failed. I'm a student, I start a company after 2 years, I go bankrupt. In Serbia, the leading corporations have made a handshake, not a contract, just a handshake, an agreement, and said, we are going to hear these founders first when we have a job to go. Yeah, the HR departments will invite them first. Not a guarantee for a job, but at least they get this chance to apply. That's a means of de-risking. Others are paying founder stipends. Yeah, so you get a basic income for 12 months or whatever if you qualify as an entrepreneur in the first few months where you develop your concept. Again, this takes the immediate economic hardship out of it, government funded. These are typical examples to drive more talent into trying out entrepreneurship. Community, looking at community development. How can we improve local connectedness, the quality of community, where we saw these gaps? Founders are not connecting as much, not helping each other as much as they possibly could. And it's rarely cultural. Yeah, everybody is willing to help if they know each other, if they meet. Maybe these meetings are not happening in the right manner and the right frequency. So what can we do around community? These would be questions we would like to ask. Centers of gravity. Should we have a place where agri-tech products are being developed, where startup founders, universities, business angels come together on a regular basis and really form a community around an interesting subsector? These are concepts we should be drilling into. In terms of startup quality, just to draw out one or two examples. Corporate and public agency engagement. So what's the most important thing as a startup founder? Get a challenge that's meaningful, that I can work towards solving with technology and a good business model. Get a client where I can test my product, proof of concept. Get to revenue, get a contract. So what can we do to open up the minds of corporate executives or even public procurement to work more with the startup ecosystem? We believe this really would drive startup quality, the ability to properly build a company, scale it properly, and get to meaningful revenue relationships fairly quickly. So that's something that we can control locally and we should be doing more of. In an early stage funding, I think we believe there are a few policy discussions that need to happen around early stage funding, ESF. Certainly the LLP Act, which is highly laudable, and then looking at further developing the business angel community. Business angels, from our perspective in early stage funding, are incredibly important. They can help in pre-seed seed by helping identify the right entrepreneurs and startups for public grants to be distributed. They are obviously a provider of money, but they're also a provider of relationships and early on business mentorship. So working with the existing business angel group, probably even improving their abilities, helping them write bigger checks, more checks to early stage startups, founders, by de-risking their activities. Sidecar funds are a good example. We can explain the details behind these concepts. These are all discussions that should be happening right now around early stage funding, around addressing the funding gap that is so obvious when we look into the data as presented here. Later on, VC development, Series A+, or any discussion around a fund of fund is something from our perspective that should happen in 23, 24 as the ecosystem grows. All going well, we are at 600 startups or something similar at this point. We have more scaling startups. It's starting to scale. We are in larger need of Series A and onward financing. So that's not the discussion for right now. We would rather focus on activities that directly contribute to more startups and more early stage funding capability. Examples here for discussion. And with that, I'd like to hand it back a little bit to open up the discussion here jointly with the ICTA and obviously you all on the call. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. The first time that Stefan did this internally, I'm guessing you would feel it right now. So bit stumped, bit of a reality kick in, and also a whole load of data to kind of sink in.
Yeah.
So hence, we've also decided when you fill up the feedback form, we have given you option that you'll be able to share the slides so that you can read and sink this in. But for now, our objective now is especially this slide that is on the screen. The whole objective of this session is to just get that reality check and to validate assumptions. Just as we tell startups, go do your market research, validate your assumptions. This is us doing that as an ecosystem. We have heard many people say, this is what you should do. This is how other people have done it. This is the right way. So this is a data-driven approach to building a holistic way of developing the startup ecosystem. And that's why ICTA and Genome has tied up. Genome has based this data on millions of data points of many countries that have been benchmarked. And this particular slide, if you can remain on this, this could be an area which all of you on this call, I'm so happy to see all different types of stakeholders on this call, Stefan. I should say from academics, corporates, ecosystem builders, enablers, investors, educators, everyone is on this call. All the important people who love this ecosystem and who's building it. So what we have put forward, what Stefan has put forward here, some we would have already built, we would already see in our ecosystem, and there are some which are opportunities which you can make a business model of or get into that space. There are certain gaps. Like the one of the first things that hit me was, I always thought we had a very good local connectedness. Why? Because within 2 steps we can get to anyone in the ecosystem. But that's not local connectedness. There is specific way of how that success factor is metrics. So without further ado, do engage us with questions. I will go to questions which have been put on the chat thread. Let me start with the first ones. Stefan, what is the key difference between community index and relationship index?
Yeah, so community is the more cultural aspect of it. Am I willing to help? Or do I get the help from somebody else? So the way we ask the question in the end is, we ask a founder, have you as a founder in the last 2 weeks devoted an hour of your time to help somebody else in the ecosystem? It's the question we are asking. We're not asking, did you receive help, but actually, did you give some? This tells us, are they willing to invest into this pay forward culture that leading good ecosystems really operate on? That's what it tells us. So it's more mindset, it's culture. Relationship is how many people do you know? I can have the right culture, the right mindset, but I'm simply sitting in a place where there are only 2 or 3 other entrepreneurs. I don't have the density around me. So I don't really know whom to ask, or I ask the same person all the time. I only get one perspective. So the number of relationships also counts. When in the end, it all plays into what we initially discussed: more startups, clusters, more density, because in the end, this gives you more relationships, gives you more insights. That's really what's happening. Both need to work, yeah? Thousands of startup entrepreneurs sitting next to each other. We know 1 or 2 places where that's the case. But the mindset is all about competition. If I help somebody else, they will steal and talk to them. They will steal my idea. Totally wrong approach, and the results are showing how detrimental such a culture is. So both needs to work in a sense.
Thanks, Stefan. I'll just continue to more questions.
Shindra, and for all of us on the call, we are not making a judgment here about founders, unnice people who are not willing to help their colleagues. That's not what we are doing. We are just seeing that for some reason it is not happening to the extent it is happening in other ecosystems. This might not be mindset or willingness. It might just be the opportunity to meet with somebody in a meaningful context. To be determined. We don't have the answer. We are only seeing in both community and relationships, it's not as strong as it should be.
Thanks, Stefan. I think the take home for us is we see that we benchmark against other countries, and we have to do better than what we're doing now. That's I think the main point for, especially I think there are regional community builders also here. There are community builders who have run many startup weekends to many things. So we have to look at some of these indicators that is being looked at by Startup Genome under the success factor matrix of what it really means to be locally connected. And let's see how to improve. I'll just get into more questions.
Sachin, sorry, Stefan, go ahead.
Just to mention it, I mean, there's analysis, there's you identify a success factor gap, and then we are saying, well, work on your local community, LC, local connectedness. How do I do that? That's more the knowledge network. So we would, if you would ask us how to do it, we would say that not us speculate, look who has done a good job at it. We would say, go to Amsterdam, go to Helsinki, who have excelled the concept of community building. Really, really fantastic work they've done. Entrepreneurs taking ownership of their community, putting some time into it, and then stepping away again. Not big government schemes. Great examples, almost no budget required, huge effects. That's something we would recommend and say, Keystone Team Amsterdam, or look what Helsinki has been doing over the last few years. Let's learn from them and see if it is applicable. I know it's a different culture, it's 10,000 miles away, but these are good concepts and principles to be looked at. So that's the kind of discussion we would like to encourage amongst you.
Thanks. So there's a question on an example on what de-risking entrepreneurship means. I'm not sure whether you already given an example. That's okay. If not, just an example of de-risking entrepreneurship.
Of de-risking, yeah, I think I try to this fairly simple example of what we try to do in Serbia. Primary failed founders. Yeah, I'm 22 years old. I failed. What do I do next? Do I get access to a job interview, preferentially, the kind of platinum card, if we speak on airline cards, to a job interview? Not a guarantee, but a job interview. That's huge. Makes a huge difference. I mean, we need to de-risk the step of, I'm deciding about my future career. I'm 25 years old. What am I going to do? The other one are very often stipends, where a founder that has not yet incubated put in place a company, but is working towards a technical concept, gets basic income for 6 or 12 months, so they can sustain their apartment and their very basic cost of living. These are very simplistic examples, and you need to have, obviously, this is government, typically government or municipality funded, depends on the ability to make such an investment.
I may just add one quick.
Yeah,
I just made a quick thing. Yeah, coming from an Asian background, it's always difficult for us as graduates, engineers, to come from middle class backgrounds and then go for an entrepreneurship career because the money is not guaranteed, right? Hence, we always say that university activation is quite very important at early stages, because you need to start sowing the seeds of cultural entrepreneurship in students very early on. And then if you de-risk it, that gives them motivation, that gives them strength to not accept fancy job offers from outside or from big industries, but actually start something from yourself. So there needs to be a cultural change in terms of when you de-risk entrepreneurship.
It is maybe threefold in a sense, and I'm seeing a question from Damika here as well. Thank you so much, Damika. Maybe three elements. The one is culture change in a society, and this is not only mindset of a student. This is mindset of friends, of family, all the ones who are influencing the decision of a young potential entrepreneur. That's communications. Kazakhstan, we saw that years ago, where the president in the end was talking about entrepreneurship in every single speech, was embedded into everything he did publicly for a while. And I don't know how consistent this carried on, but it was a good start to say, tone from the top, this is public debate. Over here, culturally different background. The top job, if you ask boys today, is to become a startup entrepreneur, a tech entrepreneur. When I grew up, it was becoming a lawyer, a doctor, or something in the like. Today, it's a startup entrepreneur. For girls, it's number 4 or 5, sadly enough, but still very, very high. This culture has massively changed in a generation. So that's the communication aspect. The other one is the simple de-risking. I mean, if I can't pay my basic needs, I'm not going to be an entrepreneur. That's stipends. That's that element. And then really having in place decent grant funding, pre-seed, seed stage funding, and that's more or less grants. The angels won't be able to do it alone. In order to get some financial runway. Maybe it's really these, not maybe, certainly it's these three things that need to happen in.
Thanks, Stefan. This is quickly get into some questions which are pouring in. Would want to concatenate both what Imal is saying and Kishan is saying, both on the approach of why should we develop both early stage funding and Series A funding simultaneously? I just read out what Imal has been saying. Don't you think we should start the process now in parallel? By the time these funds are ready to fund startups, it will take 12 to 18 months. So this is on the point of early stage funding, Series A funding. Similar question by Kishan as well. Shouldn't we focus on this parallelly?
I hope, Sashindra, I got the question correctly, but at the moment we would say the utmost priority is seed stage, early stage funding, seed stage, and making the existing angel community, 100 plus angels, even more effective. And that could mean a number of things. Most importantly, give them more financial ability to make more investments and slightly bigger ones. The technical concept we typically use we call it a sidecar fund. So it's government or some other capital provider that puts money next to the angel group. So every time the angels make a decision, another 50% of co-investment comes from the sidecar fund, which gives them just double or triple the amount of financial firepower, the ability to make more investments. It is a pretty tough. Angels are great when they work. They are the best answer at seed stage. We are absolutely convinced. But it is a pretty hard business and activation ecosystem. Lots of startups will fail. You will lose. You easily can lose money, and you might be turned off as a private investor, as a private angel, because you're not making returns in years 1, 2, 3. So I think that's something most young ecosystems are grappling with, and propping them up with a sidecar fund, a means of writing more checks and being somewhat de-risked, maybe also some intelligent tax offsets against their personal income tax. These are really good measures to take.
Thanks, Stefan. I guess the take that I've also got.
Oh, sorry, Sachendra, I think I missed number 2, or it's kind of implied in the answer. Yes, preparing for Series A now, strengthening the VC community, seeing if we can get more LP capital into it. Preparing for that, yes, but it's not a priority for 21, 22. We would think that's something that needs to be in place 24, 25. So I would say yes, starting now to think about it, but we don't actually need to put in. If you got 10 million of government money to distribute, I would park that for 2 years and then start investing.
Yep, I think even from an ecosystem perspective, it's very right to say it's the seed level of funding, which also might not attract a lot of ventures or venture funds to get into, because the returns are quite long term. And even when government looks at it, the returns are long term. It doesn't generate export revenue very fast. But as data currently shows, the amount of effort to be put in, amount of concentration, as you say, has to be significant in this space while we work on the Series A. I think that was a good take even for us from this study. So let me get into another one. Just answering Jeevan's question in terms of the policy-related question which has come to ICTA. So the impediments report, which or we call it the startup-friendly government report, which was launched, working with the 14 authorities. What we have particularly mentioned here, tax write-offs or tax set-offs for angel investments, and other things related to the conducive environment being formed in Sri Lanka is being worked at. From those 29 impediments that we identified, about 7 has now seen certain workarounds. And with these authorities, we are working at it, even with Ministry of Finance, to see how we can put these policies across. So we can guarantee that during this year, we are working on these things and these specific things. And some of it will also be submitted for the budget proposal as well, especially to strengthen the angel community, even with, while Stefan mentioned about sidecar funds, also through different fiscal policies. That's what we're working on with Ministry of Finance. So one question from
again, Sachendra, and for all of us here to give an example, and it's more from where I'm sitting. That years ago we implemented a tax offset scheme for people who wanted to make an investment into a risky asset class, into startups, with deduction if they failed, if the investments failed. Everybody, professional investor, but even my grandmother could invest into a startup, and if we lost money, it would be offset against income tax. This has moved billions into our ecosystem. This is tax policy that's for the Ministry of Finance to consider, because obviously it's reducing tax revenue, so it makes the entire community pay, or the entire population pay for the luxury. But it has proven to be an incredibly good investment at some point. Wondering, are there any more questions that we should be?
Sachindra's screen is frozen. Stefan, there's one on this one by Chalinda, who asks, even founders are risk averse according to the data, since they focus on local problems. How do we change their mindset?
Just
Sorry
reading
about
it,
that.
Shalinda, thank you very much for your question. So you say local investors are risk averse and only look for guaranteed returns. I mean, obviously, you know where we are in the startup ecosystem with a 90% failure rate. I'm not talking about Sri Lanka, I'm talking about the world. This is not guaranteed returns. I think the concepts we were mentioning here, de-risking, business angels, etc., tax policy that allows offsetting losses, that's a really good piece of policy that can manage that expectation a little bit. There's also a certain mindset. Lots of high net worth individuals are, I mean, you know it better than I do, are coming from property investment or traditional investment. And for them, it is a big mindset change to invest into a high risk, high reward asset class, where you can't even do due diligence properly. The old way of doing due diligence, how you would do it for a property or an SME, doesn't work in a startup environment. So to really bring a number of skills, we call it tech immersion, some executive education that helps potential angels, high net worth individuals, to understand what it is they are dealing with, and to also work properly, fairly, eye to eye with a startup founder, and to speak almost the right language. So that's the educational element. I think we say it here a little bit, business angel group activation. What we also mean is helping people, to high net worth individuals, to understand what they invest in and how they should behave fairly, transparently, to work with a startup founder. Yeah, that's not fiscal policy, that's mindset, and that's culture. And it's probably more difficult to do.
Sorry, I got kicked out. I've not been able to overcome that impediment when I joined from home. On the
sorry, so I'm seeing the second part of this question as well. Even founders are risk averse. I think in the beginning I was quoting this German example. Technically great, very sophisticated, but risk averse. So they're very happy to find a small contract, get revenue, get positive, P&L positive very quickly, but totally forgetting the scaling. And then 5 years later, somebody else in the States already has built a solution and scaled it to 20 countries. The opportunity is lost. Yeah, that's what's happening here in Europe quite a bit. Certainly a question of funding. Do you get the right business angel funding? Do you get a Series A afterwards? But particularly the business angel stage, I think that's important. And then to have a mentor who actually pushes an entrepreneur a bit and says, well, you go another 3-4 months till your product is really ready. Don't go to market prematurely. I think these are the two elements. So enough financial runway, but also a mentor that can kick the tires a little bit and say, you need to do a bit more if you really want to become a category leader. Is always a big word. Not everybody is going to be an Uber tomorrow, but to push it to a degree where it is really a competitive product.
We got about 7 minutes more, and if there are any last minute questions for Akshat and Stefan, especially through the experience that they've hired in some of these areas, if you need examples. Okay, just one came in. What's the best way to attract startups and investors from other countries according to Startup Genome?
Difficult. So that's the first answer, and it's not one you want to hear, but positively speaking, if you build at later stages, when startups scale, they typically find investments. Not a problem for anybody to find Series B, because you can show something. You got clients, you got product, you got revenue, you got a proper company. You will find Series B regardless of where you sit in the world. It's still easy in Silicon Valley or London, but you will find it if you sit somewhere else. It's much harder if you're at seed stage to find a foreign investor to really engage. I think organic growth, your own talent, your own local investors, high net worth individuals, angels, yes. Diaspora is obviously a good one. See, are there successful entrepreneurs abroad? And I think they are already making a big contribution in Sri Lanka, as they are doing in India and in other places. Can we do even more to interest them, to make it effective for them to engage with startups, with a business angel group in Sri Lanka, Colombo? Probably that's something to look at, but I think that's the first port of call. Waiting for Atomico or Balderton Capital to land all of a sudden, they will only come if they find the more mature companies for a Series A plus, for a Series B round, typically.
Yeah, Land has initiated this and doing a good job at attracting diaspora right now. So
yeah,
more
I mean,
support.
what you want to avoid is to attract a VC firm. They open up an office, but in the end, it just becomes a conveyor belt for taking an entrepreneur and saying, well, you seem a good concept. I give you some funding, but you have to relocate somewhere else to Singapore. I mean, that's not what you, from an economic and policy perspective, want to achieve. So let's sort out seed stage at home organically before we try to attract foreign capital.
There's a question from Suresh. Who would be ideal partners for the ecosystem development from outside the country?
Quite a lot of people would be my answer. What do I mean? I was quoting this example from community building. Look at Helsinki. Engage for free. They will engage with you. They will have a dialogue, and you can take these ideas and concepts and tweak them. I think I would work with quite a number of these best practice examples. They are in our network, and Sashindra, you and your team, you have complete access to it, to really engage on a one-on-one basis and say, I want to build a better angel community and I want to develop a sidecar. There are 3 or 4 ecosystems who have done it extremely well. Connecting with them would be the right answer, I think. I don't think there's the one partner organization. Do I call Plug and Play? Do I call Techstars? Do I call Y Combinator? Lots of people try doing that. It's very expensive. I'm not so sure it's generating the results for a local community. I think the really good communities are led by entrepreneurs minds and entrepreneurial minded people in the public sector coming together properly. That's what it is.
So if any of the enablers on this call want to get connected to certain ecosystem players in other countries, do connect to us. And with the network that Startup Genome has opened up to us, what the European Union Sri Lanka Innovation Partnership has opened up to us, we'll be able to connect you with incubators, research centers, academic areas, so on and so forth. Thank you for that. So we are able to help in that sense. And one question on, is Sri Lanka ready for agriculture startup? I just picked this, Stefan, in terms of identifying our niche, which you mentioned, the subsector. If you can say a bit on that area.
Yeah, I hope this was clear enough in the presentation, but where we are coming from is to say, if this is a massive ecosystem, then I can develop everything. London can go into every sector in the world, or New York, because it's got the size. If I have limited number of startups, if I have limited number of resource, budget, capability, mentors, business angels, it is easier to manage. It's more successful typically to focus on a few clusters. And that's not denying somebody the opportunity. If somebody wants to develop a gaming company, of course they will. But are you designing an accelerator specifically for that, or are you betting the effort on agricultural tech? Because it's important to Sri Lanka, it's an export factor, and you actually got a lot of people who understand farming and food production properly. Not technology necessarily, but the foundations of this sector. Absolutely. In Zurich, I would do fintech, yes, of course, because people understand financial services very, very well. Would I do gaming there? Probably not. Yeah, it depends on what it is. All we have seen in activation ecosystems, they're typically well advised to focus on 3-4 niches, where they can really carve out a niche and become a little bit more, also more renowned. Sometimes interesting to see there are small places in the world that are renowned for a particular subsector, and they actually start attracting international capital. They start attracting international talent because they are renowned for this niche. Frankfurt is a good example. I know it's not comparable, but 10 years ago, there was nothing in terms of startups there. All of a sudden, there's a hugely attractive fintech center. Fintech, not much else.
Thanks, Stefan. And to answer Lakshman's question, the AgTech Forum at ICTA is done by the Technology Diffusion team, hopes to include or attract the various angel investors specifically for these verticals. So if you're not connected already, do connect with us to Startups that I said, okay, I will connect you to them. I think final question, actually from me to Akshat, to talk a bit about the GSER and how important it is to open up data, especially when it's the founder survey and when it's Crunchbase. I'm happy to say, even to answer Kishan's question, right now we have around 100 deals on Crunchbase. A few months back, we had about 40. Many deals being supported by the ecosystem enablers have been updated, and this will definitely get into the ecosystem value calculation of the GSER. And in terms of numbers, I could tell you that to an amount of the 100 deals comes to an amount of $67.2 million for the past 10 years. And we could look at what's Series A now, what's the amount for the past 3 years. That basically, if I can give a number, since 2018, we had 52 deals, counting for $24.6 million. So all this was possible because we were able to collect all this data into Crunchbase. And Akshat, over to you just to explain how the GSER is done and how important data sharing is.
Yeah, thanks, Sachin. Again, a lot of our secondary data comes from secondary sources, right? So we request you to add your deals if you know of startups that have gone through funding rounds or grants or Series A later rounds to add it on Crunchbase. And it's not really just for us as well, right? Once you add your deals to the ecosystem, it's not just Startup Genome, but all across the world, people are accessing Crunchbase. So it makes the Sri Lankan ecosystem look much better. There's a lot more information that people can go through. And definitely when we're doing our rankings on GSER, we download the data from 3 sources, from which Crunchbase is one of the main ones. So yeah, request you to please add deals, information of companies on Crunchbase, and we'll be happy to connect you with our partner over there. And Sachin, you've already connected to our Crunchbase partner. So yeah, do that, and yeah, let's make Sri Lanka more Sri Lanka's ecosystem more accessible, not just to Startup Genome, but other organizations in the world as well.
Thank you for saying that, Akshat. So please don't do it for us and for our reports. Yeah, that's a side effect, but do it because every investor and many startup entrepreneurs are using Deal Room, Crunchbase, PitchBook to see is there an interesting hotbed of a certain subsector, is there certain investment happening? You want to be on that map. Yeah, don't do it for us, do it for yourselves. So you start attracting visibility, and it will help to attract and to build more global connectivity, actually, GC, which we showed still lacking a bit. Yeah. It's a small effort, yeah.
I think we've come a long way in data sharing from a point where people didn't want to share their idea, even when they pitched on Spiralation, to a point where now we are sharing investment data. So that's a great deal. So if anyone wants to share some of the investment data that if startups are on board, and if you run cohorts, do let us know. Thank you for those who have already done it. We can funnel it, connect you to Crunchbase and get there. And also good news is in September, the GSER 2021 will be launched, and Sri Lanka will also be featured. And fingers crossed, we'll have our ecosystem value, which was 117 million in the last ecosystem report. We'll see a really good increase in the new report to come. And I'm thinking some of the data that we presented on funding here also, Stefan, was before pre-Crunchbase renaissance. And now I think the data that we will capture also will be quite different. So thanks for that. So finally, since we come to the end, see if I can take one more question. Right, okay, this is the personal one.
Maybe, Shindra, if I may, I'm seeing an interesting comment here from Suresh to say we are happy to support in this journey. It took us 5 years to where we are, and you should be very, very proud of where you are. 450 startups, very advanced, great technical talent. I'm conscious we've only be speaking about gaps, and this always sounds a bit negative, but it's our job. We want to help you address and guide policy in the right direction. So we are not coming to tell you everything is wonderful and we walk away. That's not the point. This is a potential to go to a very different phase. If you got 1,000 startups, 600 make it. You will see these exponential effects. It will make a big, big difference. It's not going to take another 5 years. You might see them in 2 years.
Yeah, I mean it's amazing. Amazing motivation, and I think there's so much we in collaboration can do, and ICTA is again a facilitator. Our role is to facilitate and support the enablers, support the startups, support the enablers, support their startups, and to build the ecosystem from strength to strength. So thank you once again for all who join this call. Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you, Akshat, for doing a great job with the assessment. We'll be sharing the assessment through our feedback form. Please take a few minutes to fill this feedback form. We've asked a small set of questions, and I've also asked how you can, would you like to collaborate with us and also given certain information. Do fill it, and if you request the presentation slide, do note it in the request form itself. And also we've asked you to rate the speakers and how they're deliverable so that we can send it back to Stefan, and Stefan has been very kind in doing this webinar. I hope all those who participated were first of all stumped as I was when I first heard this, with the reality kicking, but motivated to work as a local community, to strengthen the local community and work in collaboration to build this startup ecosystem to get to the next stages of growth. And that will be our collective purpose, leaving all differences aside. That's what we should be doing. So thank you once again, Akshat, Stefan. Any last words by Akshat and Stefan before we close it up?
Akshat, you want to go first, please?
Sorry, I was muted. First of all, thank you so much. I've been working very closely with everyone in the ecosystem. So thank you to all. It was great seeing the progress of Sri Lanka. On a just a note, I would also like to thank Sachendra, you and Nevindri, and of course the ICTA team for being such great hosts and helping us throughout this journey of about 5 to 6 months, where we conducted the founder interviews, and then of course the qualitative interviews, and then of course the assessment. So thank you all, and hope we continue this collaboration.
And Nevindri, Sachendra, thanks so much for organizing, for giving us the opportunity to work with Sri Lanka on an ongoing basis. We've had so many discussions and we really value them. And to all of you for making 2 hours of your time available today on this webinar. Please, I'm very conscious that some concepts, when you hear them the first time, may sound a little bit theoretical. They need interpretation, they need practical examples. We try to give a few. If you want to hear more, please come back to us. We are an organization that prides itself in bringing ecosystems together and fostering knowledge exchange. That's what we are here for. So please use the opportunity as you see fit. We want to see success and the exchange of good ideas as far as possible. So big thank you for giving us the opportunity, and please use us going forward.
Thank you, Stefan, Akshat. And so on behalf of my colleague Nevindri and our co-host Startup Genome, I would like to invite all of you on this call to look at the information which has been shared now, look at the gaps that are there in the ecosystem, and do present to us areas that you can support. It could be through services, it could be through individual support, wherever. Please write to us through the feedback form and engage with us. Now you'll see what the gaps are, where we need to improve. So let's work together, and please do work with us in collaboration towards the startup nation. Thank you very much once again, and wishing all of you a pleasant evening. Thank you.